With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being with us on this Monday right here on Tactics, whether you're watching us on YouTube Live, on Facebook Live, on Twitch, Periscope, Twitter. However you're watching us, we certainly appreciate you making us a part of your day and taking time to try to be informed on everything that is going on in the state of Alabama, the nation, and the world. We appreciate you being here on Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. Thank you so much for being here with us on the program, and I know that my show schedule has been incredibly unpredictable of late. I am working on that, and we're trying to tighten down some screws. There's just been a lot going on campus here, and with my recent trip to Ukraine, I had a lot to catch up on, but hopefully we'll be back for the long haul, at least. That is the plan, and this is a story that actually has a little bit of age on it, but I mean, it was just too important not to cover, and I will tell you my rationale behind it. It goes to Bob Francis O'Rourke. Some people know him as Beto, but I call him by his given birth name, Bob Francis, because, well, it's his real name. He tried to pull an Elizabeth Warren and make it sound like he was Hispanic. He tried to act as though he was of a different race, but for all, just, you know, as a heads up, because we're going to be talking about him a lot today, whenever I say Bob Francis, I am, of course, talking about Bob Francis O'Rourke. So he did come to the Yellowhammer State. He was recently here in Alabama and had a lot to say. But I know that a lot of you are probably sitting there thinking, Caleb, why do I care? Why even bother talking about the guy? He's irrelevant. There's no chance that he winds up winning the presidential nomination. After this display, there's a good chance he doesn't even wind up in national politics again. All of those statements are true. I'm not arguing with any of them. So if that is your thought process, you and I have no disagreement. But there is a good reason to talk about him. There's a good reason that he's relevant. Not because Bob Francis himself is relevant, but because he has said many, many times that he will become whatever candidate that you want me to be. And that's the key. And I'll explain all of this in full here just in a second. But it's interesting to me because the guy has already lost, that he's basically turned himself into the crazy ex-boyfriend that his, the girl ditched him and now he really wants her back. I said this several weeks ago that he had gone that route. Well, since that time has passed, because originally he was just getting desperate, he was falling in the polls, the Democrats were falling out of love with him, and so he was doing some damage control, he was trying to get the Democrats back, he was, standing outside in the Democrats' yard with a boombox, playing Endless Love and Careless Whisper, so he's been doing this for a while, but after a while, he noticed that it wasn't working, and the girl in this case being the DNC, although I don't know if she identifies as a girl or not, so that may be a whole other a whole other question. I think that Bob Francis would actually appreciate if she didn't identify as a girl, because that would give him some intersectionality cred. He could be a gay guy like Pete Buttigieg, and let's face it, Pete Buttigieg is just a gayer version of Beto O'Rourke, who's slightly better at being a politician. So, anyway, Beto O'Rourke has moved past the crazy X phase into the stalker X phase, where he's like setting himself on fire to prove how much he loves the girl. Like that's how this has evolved over time. And because of that, he's just saying whatever crazy out of left field thing that he can say that he thinks might get the Democrats to start paying attention to him again and might make him relevant. And so he's cutting himself and throwing himself into fire pits and setting himself on fire, trying to get the DNC's attention. Please look at me. Please love me again. That's basically Beto O'Rourke's shtick as it is right now. So Bob Francis trying really, really hard to get voters to come back to him. And I think that the reason that in a weird way kind of his irrelevance kind of makes him relevant again is this. He is a perfect mirror for the Democrat base because of it, because this is a man who has said many, many times before, I will become whatever you want me to be. He said this back when he was running for Senate in Texas. He has said this since he's been running for president. Basically, I am a blank slate, paint upon me whatever politician you want, which means that what Beto O'Rourke is doing, whatever he says, whatever he does, in his mind, is a reflection of the Democrat base. And that's what makes him relevant. The fact that this is somebody who is on the inside and has very expensive Democrat strategists and political consultants telling him, Beto, this is what you need to be. This is what you need to transform into to get the Democrat base's vote, which means what? That whatever Bob Francis does, we can then understand is what is really in the base of the Democrat Party's heart. We can get an inside look at who they are and what they are. Now, granted, we're getting that inside look, and it's not really surprising anybody. Like, it's not this big revelation to people that are paying attention. But it may be a big revelation to the people that are kind of in the middle, that are kind of moderate, that haven't really made up their mind. They don't really watch a lot of news. I mean, they catch it maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks to just kind of try to keep up. But really, unless there's a story that really grabs them, they're not paying a lot of attention to it. And I'm not talking about cable news specifically. I'm talking about all news overarching, period. They might catch a broadcast here or there. They might read an article on Facebook or another social media site here and there, but really, they don't make it a point to keep up. If you can explain all of this to one of your Democrat friends, somebody that is contemplating one of the people in this field, that, hey, just to give you a heads up, Beto O'Rourke is a perfect mirror of what the majority of the Democrat base is. Doesn't mean all Democrat voters, doesn't mean all registered Democrats. But that base that right now is leading the party and driving it, Bob is a great mirror to understand who they are and what they stand for. And that is what makes him relevant. Ironically, his irrelevance is fading out of the limelight when it comes to the Democrat primaries, is actually what caused him to be a really good mirror for the Democrat base. So in all of this, and this is where our local tie-in comes in, Bob Francis made a recent trip to the capital city of Montgomery. He also spoke at the semi-annual Alabama Democrat Convention in Birmingham. We're just going to look through a few of the things that he talked about, and I want you to always keep this in the back of your mind, that Bob Francis is a perfect mirror for the Democrat base, and because of that, you can get a really deep insight into what they really value, what's important to them, the issues that they feel are at the forefront by watching him and what he says. So I want you to take a look at this first one from his visit to Montgomery. Any second now. There we go.
You all probably know this, but in that same community, in North Texas, more than a year ago, Botham Jean, young black man, killed in his own home, in his apartment, by a police officer who walked in. And not only was he shot and killed, and not only did the police leak information later saying that Botham Jean had some small amount of weed in his apartment, as though that would justify the killing of an unarmed man in his own apartment in America in this day and age. But when the trial was finally conducted, the judge was going to allow the defense, Amber Geiger, to use the castle doctrine, the stand your ground doctrine. Standing your ground in someone else's apartment while you shoot them dead. Mm-hmm. So whether it is the fact that racism, systemic, foundational, endemic, is alive and well in this country, and really being brought out into the open, unlike any other time in my life, by the most racist president we've had probably since Andrew Johnson at the end of the Civil War.
All right, so a lot of things to unpack in that little talk. First of all, before we get into any of the content, congratulations to Bob Francis on packing out that living room that they put you in. I mean, I get that it's a red state, but really, he's a major candidate for the political party. I mean, was somebody that was a contender for front. I don't think that he can even make it back to the front place anymore. I don't see that path available to him. But this is a major presidential candidate coming to the capital city of the state. There's like, what, 30 people in there? I mean, come on. You get 5 times that at the Prattville Chick-fil-A on a Tuesday night, even on a slow night. There's more people than that in the Chick-fil-A. But anyway, so that's Bob Francis really packing out that living room that they wound up putting him in. But here's the thing. Virtually everything about that story is either a complete lie or 100% misleading. In other words, it's true, but the way that he said it leads you to the exact opposite conclusion of what is actually true. Now, I covered this story, talked a lot about it, spent almost an entire show just on that and breaking it down. And you know, I 100% agree with the verdict. I think that the sentencing probably could have even been more harsh, and I would have been fine with it when it came to Amber Geiger. So it's not that I'm on the opposite side of the argument that Bob Francis is on. But regardless of whether I agree with some of the sentiments behind his argument, I have to call him out for basically just straight up lying about the case. So first of all, the Castle Doctrine, completely different from Stand Your Ground. Completely different. Because what Stand Your Ground deals with is your ability to basically stand and defend yourself where you are if you feel that you're being attacked. It sort of nullifies, or at least gives an ability to not necessarily flee the scene first, that you can stand there and defend yourself where you are if you feel threatened or attacked. Castle Doctrine is completely different because it deals with being in your own home. That's the difference. Stand Your Ground has nothing to do with your home. Absolutely nothing. It can apply if you're in your home, but really it's kind of irrelevant in your home because of the Castle Doctrine. These are two completely different legal theories. Why would he lie about that? Why would he use Stand Your Ground instead of Castle Doctrine? Because in a lot of people's minds, especially on the left, Stand Your Ground is associated with racism. Now, it has nothing to do with race, but because of Trayvon Martin, and because of that case and where Stand Your Ground was used as a defense for the guy that wound up killing Trayvon, because of that, they associate it with racism. Has nothing to do with race, has nothing to do with racism. It was not put in place to have any advantage to attacker, defender, no advantage to a white person or a black person. Like, it wasn't written that way. Nor was it passed, to try to give advantage to one side or the other. But the point is, because a lot of people, especially black people, associate the first thing they hear, it's a trigger word. When they hear Stand Your Ground, they hear, oh, a racist law. That's why he used that, even though it was never in play in this case. Because he wants to drum up images of racism in our judicial system in their mind, because that's the point of what he's saying. And here's the thing. The reason that the Castle Doctrine was allowed to be considered is because even though Geiger was not in her apartment, she believed that she was. And they weren't applying it to decide whether or not she acted reasonably, they were applying it to see whether or not she acted reasonably because she believed that she was in her own apartment. Now, the details of the case showed very clearly that a reasonable person, much less a police officer, should have believed that they were in their apartment given all of the clues they had on the way into it. For example, the red doormat that was underneath, all of the surrounding details to suggest that she was on the wrong floor. The point is, they had no reason to believe that Geiger was reasonable in assuming that she was in her own apartment, but they were saying, if you believe that she did, You are allowed to consider whether or not her actions were reasonable based on someone who did believe that they were in their apartment. So it's mischaracterizing and just basically pulling all the nuance out of that argument when he just says, well, they were going to consider just allowing her. He makes it sound as though they were just going to let her off scot-free, and that's why this consideration was put into place, which is absurd on a number of levels. Because it wasn't reasonable for her to believe that she was in her apartment in the first place. Therefore, even though the castle doctrine was allowed to be considered, it really doesn't apply if you don't believe that a reasonable person would believe they were in their own apartment in her situation. And then it brings us to the broader question. Even if the guy is guilty as sin, you always give every possible consideration to the accused. Why? 2 reasons. First of all, it prevents mistrial, or at least strengthens the case against a mistrial, because then the defense could come up and claim that there was a mistrial because they refused to consider a legitimate legal precedent or a legitimate legal argument for why the person was being mishandled by the judicial system. So in other words, by allowing that, they were strengthening the case. They were strengthening the staying power of the verdict that eventually we know with hindsight was murder. And then the second part of that is, if you did not consider a specific legal angle for the accused, that makes an appeal more likely to happen and to overturn the verdict of the lower court. So there's several reasons why it actually made a lot of sense. Now, I don't think the judicial system should already have a preconceived idea of whether somebody is guilty or innocent. We have the presumption of innocence even in the most horrendous cases like this one. But the important thing to understand here is you give the accused basically every opportunity so that if they still come up short, it is much harder to get that verdict overturned. So if you were vying for, you shouldn't be vying for one verdict or the other unless you've already seen and heard the evidence. But if you were just vying for a particular verdict, a murder verdict in this case, then really you should want the accused to have every conceivable option and every conceivable defense available to them so that that can be an ironclad verdict that will be very difficult to overturn. And then there's the final point. The judge that allowed that to be considered, Judge Tammy Kemp of Texas, is a black woman. So Beto O'Rourke completely mischaracterizes the whole thing. He tries to drum up this image in their heads of some evil white judge that's looking down and saying, oh, well, she should be allowed to consider the stand your ground doctrine because, well, you know, we can't have her wind up actually getting a murder verdict. This is the judge that was black saying that. So you can cast it all you want to. Racism was not a factor in that decision. The judge that made the decision is a black woman. Beto O'Rourke is doing nothing but trying to throw red meat at his liberal buddies because he knows that they'll eat it up. That's all this is. And again, with the final conclusion and the sentiments of the case, I agree with actually where Beto O'Rourke landed, but a lot of the details he's just straight up lying to people about, and that's not okay. Especially when you're doing so to try to gain cheap political points. By the way, I did have somebody mention this to me not too long ago. I had a fraternity brother, YT, that brought this up. By the way, that stands for Young and Talented. But YT brought this up to me. He said, when it comes to political red meat, when you're throwing it to the right, he says, if you're throwing it to the left, is it political tofu? Which I thought was actually pretty clever. So Bob Francis throwing some political tofu to the people in Montgomery when he's talking to them. And then that brings us to the final thing that he said that I wanted to touch on here, that Trump is the worst and most racist president since Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson is a horrible person. I mean, somebody that from the historic record, we know not only abused his slaves, but actually slept with them. He was the Manifest Destiny guy. He's the one that drove people, significant for Alabama specifically, because he was the one that orchestrated the Trail of Tears. We know that he was just absolutely abysmal to the Native Americans, made deals with them, and then straight up screwed them and just didn't keep his word. And by the way, used the land that he screwed them out of to give to his rich buddies that were around him in his political sphere. So yes, a horrible, corrupt, evil, racist man, who, by the way, is the founder of the Democrat Party. So I do think it pretty ironic that Beto O'Rourke even admits that Johnson was a horrible person and then kind of ignores the fact that, oh yeah, he's the founder of the party I'm currently running to represent. But is Trump really the most racist president since Johnson? Let's take a look, shall we? First of all, you have Woodrow Wilson, who screened the first movie ever projected in the White House. And you know what that movie was? Birth of a Nation. Literally a Ku Klux Klan propaganda movie. He made that the first movie ever screened in the White House because he was very sympathetic to the Klan, and praised and lauded it in his commentary afterward after having seen it. Just praised it on end. We have the records. We have him talking about it. The guy was a Klan sympathizer. Then there's Teddy Roosevelt. So see, it's not just Democrats. We're including Republicans in this as well. And then you have Teddy Roosevelt, who actually advocated for white nationalism and eugenics in the White House, saying that races that weren't white, we should consider, invoking some eugenics and trying to weed out the population that we don't want in his case. Then you have FDR, who appointed Hugo Black, an actual Klansman from Alabama, to the Supreme Court. And I'm not talking about, well, he had some association with the Klan or he spoke at a Klan rally once. That would be bad enough. No, he was an actual initiated card-carrying member of the Klan. And that was actually probably the most famous of all of FDR's Supreme Court nominations. I would argue it was the most significant, at least. And then you have guys like Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was notorious for his use of both racial slurs towards black and Asians. I mean, just said some horrible things about any of them, all of them. And here's an interesting thing that I found out. He actually kept a snake in his trunk to scare off black people because there was a superstition or a stereotype that black people were afraid of snakes, which I don't know anybody that's not like... I mean, obviously some people are more afraid than others, but I'm considered somebody that's not really afraid of snakes in the sense that I have a phobia. I've killed several of them myself. But even if I saw somebody throw a snake, like a rubber snake at me and didn't know it was fake, that I'd jump too. So it's a weird thing, like who's not afraid of a snake biting them? But anyway, so LBJ, because of the black stereotype, he kept a snake in his trunk specifically to scare black people. And he also refused to call his chauffeur, who was black, by his name, specifically telling him that nobody cared what his name was because he's black and that's all they see. I mean, you can look all of this up. By all means, fact check me on that. And then, of course, you have William Clinton, who actually eulogized Robert Byrd, another card-carrying Klansman, went to his funeral and defended his membership in the Klan, saying that, well, that was just, he had to do it to get elected. He had to be in the Klan. So let's not pretend as though Trump is the only president that has had a tumultuous relationship with race. I would say compared to any of those guys, his is far better, and I still see no evidence that Trump is actually racist. He said some racially insensitive things. I think that's fair. But the most racist president since Andrew Jackson? Come on, Bob. You can do better than that. Well, I don't know that he can do better than that, but certainly there is, certainly he could come up with a more compelling argument than that. So let's go ahead and look at this other one. And this actually comes from Birmingham, where he was doing his speaking engagement there to the semi-annual Democrat convention for Alabama Democrats.
This country, though we may not be in El Paso, Texas, is still racist at its foundation, at its core, and throughout this system. This country, though El Paso is one of the safest cities in America.
So that's Bob Francis. You heard him yourself. It is absolutely at its foundation, at its core, it is racist. Racism everywhere. America founded on racism. That's his argument. Now, remember, in all of this that I said, Bob Francis is a perfect mirror for the left. Ultimately, this is what they really believe. And this is why they want to tear all of this down. That is the reason that they believe America is evil and racist at its core, that it was founded upon slavery and racism, that was instrumental in its foundation. Now, the history suggests the complete opposite, actually. But that's what they believe, and that's the reason they want to tear the whole thing down. And what I want you to notice most is not even that Bob Francis said that, because we kind of already know that he's a nut. Did you notice that a bunch of, not just Democrats, Alabama Democrats, enthusiastically applauding this? This is who they are. This is what they believe. We like to think that the Democrats in this state, because they're red state Democrats, that they're more moderate, that they're not nearly as unhinged or crazy. You just had a crowd populated exclusively with Alabama Democrats enthusiastically applauding the idea that this country is racist at its core and its foundation, and the whole thing needs to be uprooted and completely undone and rebuilt from the beginning. That is what you just heard. Remember that when you contemplate voting for an Alabama Democrat because, oh, they're a red state Democrat. They're not like the national Democrats. No. They believe those same foundational things. And it really is a testament to why the Democrats in Alabama and everywhere else despise America. They hate it. And I know that some people are going to be watching this and say, no, they don't hate America. They just think that it's racist and at its core and at its foundation. Well, here's the thing. You're caught in a catch-22 there. Because if you really believed that America was racist at its core and its foundation, I would actually think that you were a bad person for not wanting to undo that, for not wanting to tear it all down and build it back up again. I'm being genuine here. But I do think it places you in a catch-22. Now, I don't believe that it is racist at its foundation or at its core. I believe that there was racism that went on at the time of the founding, but that's different than racism and slavery being the foundation. In fact, if you're looking at the foundation, in other words, the forging of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, efforts were made at each of those three junctures to try to undo slavery and make a way for slavery to be done away with entirely. They didn't always succeed at those endeavors, but the point is there was a strong, concerted, and nearly successful effort in a couple of cases to make slavery illegal right at the onset of the United States of America. And when you're looking at thousands upon thousands of years of tradition of man owning other men, mankind having other men as slaves, and America was able to undo that in 84 years, that's actually pretty impressive. Obviously, it's not ideal. We should have gotten rid of it from the very beginning. It is, I would argue, second only to abortion in the greatest sins that America has ever committed. It's a blight on our history, sure. But my point is, if you're looking at it in full context and looking at it compared to the rest of human history, the fact that we were able to make efforts at the very start, at the very beginning of our nation to try to undo it, and we were still able to undo it and make great strides against it for the next 84 years before finally getting rid of it, that is something to be proud of as a nation. Not perfect. Not saying there's not room for criticism, because there obviously is. But I'm just saying that I would be hesitant on the left to try to push this narrative that the whole country is racist at its core and that the whole thing needs to be torn down. It's simply not true. Let's look at another thing that kind of coincides with this. This is another clip of Bob Francis speaking in Birmingham.
When it comes to this foundational racism in America, it teaches us that the foundation of this country is not the 4th of July, 1776, but the 20th of August, 1619. The first time someone was brought here in bondage to build the wealth and the success and the greatness of America.
All right, so again, and for those of you who aren't aware what he's talking about, because I know it's hard to understand, the audio is not great in there. What he was saying is the real foundation of America is 1619, and that's because that's when the first slave was brought here. That's patently absurd on a number of reasons. It would be like if you had your favorite restaurant and you find out years later, after having eaten there, let's say it's, I tell you what, I ate there today. Let's say it was Vicky's Lunch Van here in Montgomery. Phenomenal burger, excellent, highly encourage you to go there. Let's say that you found out that the building that Vicky's is in used to be a McDonald's and you don't like McDonald's hamburgers, so you're not going to eat there anymore. That's insane. That's completely under new management. It's not even the same restaurant. It's not the same owner. It's completely different. The only thing that remained the same was the space occupied. America was not founded in 1619. If you're wanting to say that the land itself is the standard, well, then there were people living here way before 1619. They were Native Americans. And oh, by the way, they owned slaves. In fact, the slavery ownership rate in Native American places, in their compounds or in their natural land, whatever, when slavery was actually ended by the 13th Amendment, at that time, the ownership rate of slaves in Native American portions of the country were far greater than that of white people in the South. Way more. And so this idea that that was the foundation, first of all, slavery did not start in America in 1619. Native American tribes had been holding slaves for generations at that point. You're talking about the first time somebody was brought over from another country and then indentured in servitude to European settlers. That's a completely different thing. Furthermore, we had a revolution since then, a pretty bloody one, and then had a civil war 84 years after that to rectify that problem. And so it's a completely different country. The foundation was indeed in 1776. Bob Francis is just, again, trying to throw red meat out, or in this case, tofu, to the left to try to get them to applaud for him. Because if that is the standard, does that mean New Zealand is a racist country and their foundation is when the British Empire brought slaves over? What about South Africa? What about Australia? What about Canada? Like, if you're looking at countries that the British Empire brought slaves over because their citizens were allowed to own slaves, and that is the new standard, well, then most of the globe is actually racist and founded upon slavery. It's an absurd standard to hold. We're under completely new management, and unlike those other countries that I just mentioned, we actually had a revolution to overturn them. All the other countries, they kissed the ring of England so that they could get their liberty and their independence from them. We got it through bloody revolution. So if there was ever a country that could claim a clean break from England, it's us. We were under new management in 1776. And so this idea that the foundation of America was in 1619 is patently absurd by any standard that you could put forward. All right, let's look at the next one. This one, it's not something that's surprising or new information, but I do want to sort of grab on to something that he's talking about. This is, again, Bob Francis talking in Birmingham to the Alabama Democrats.
Do the right thing when it comes to health care. Universal, guaranteed, high-quality care for every child, every woman, every man in America, without regard to cost, fortune, or luck. It is a human right upon which every single one of us should be able to depend.
All right, so a couple things to note about that. First of all, again, this goes to my earlier point. When you're thinking about Democrats, red state Democrats, they're far more moderate and they're not nearly as on board with this socialism bandwagon. Again, you just heard Bob Francis advocate for full-on socialized medicine, universal health care, one of the pillars of communism as noted by Karl Marx. And the Alabama Democrats enthusiastically applauding. So don't give me this crap about, well, Alabama Democrats are different. We can vote for them. They're really moderates. They're blue dog Democrats. Bull crap. You just saw what the Alabama Democrats are really in favor of. But this idea that healthcare is a human right is flawed for a number of reasons. First of all, for something to be a human right, and I'm just going to go through this briefly, it must be God-given, it must be inherent from birth, and it must not require the consent of another. Now, let's look for a standard, just to give you an example, of freedom of speech. Well, that's something that's God-given. God gives us the ability to communicate, to think, to be able to communicate freely amongst people. We have it inherent from birth. Now, obviously, you can't speak when you're born, but you can gesture, you have expression, you have the ability to do that. And then as you grow older, and especially by the time that you're an adult, you have that ability of communication one with another. So it's inherent from birth. And then finally, it does not require the consent of another. Your ideas and for you to be able to speak does not require permission from another human being. That's something you're able to do on your own. And it's true that governments can try to tamp that down. They could take your life. They could try to silence you in other ways. They could try to put you in a prison cell or try to, if you're a member of the media, cut off your microphone, cut off your typewriter, whatever it may be. So they can try to infringe upon it. They can try to stifle it, but they can't really take it away from you. They may be able to throw you in a prison cell, but unless they cut out your tongue, they can't stop you from speaking. And even if they cut out your tongue, they can't keep you from gesturing. And so it's a thing that the government can try to infringe upon and can definitely try to run over your right. They shouldn't, but they can. But ultimately, it's something that government really can't take away from you in the truest sense of the word. Not unless they kill you. And so that's one of the things that we can understand by looking at it and observing it. It is most definitely an inherent God-given right. That's not true with healthcare. Because to have healthcare, first of all, you don't have it at birth. It is not automatic that a person, a medical professional, is going to have to care for you from birth. We know this because for eons and eons in human history, there was no such thing, and even after there was, it wasn't something that was guaranteed. We cannot say, for example, that a person that was born in 2000 BC is less human than they are now because we have more healthcare now. Well, they did have the right to speech, they had the right to bear arms, they had the right to freedom of religion, or at least it's something that they were supposed to have. It was something that was inherent to them. That's completely different than something like healthcare, which is a service. It is a commodity. It is something that another person can do for you, but is not something that they must do to you. So it's a completely different standard. And furthermore, when it comes to that, if you're going to say that some kind of service is a right, it's something that is obligated, well, then it shouldn't require the consent of another person. Because if that is the case, you are now infringing upon their liberty. Because if it's something that you know, it's something that you have, and somebody else has the ability to take it away from you, then it's not really yours. And if it's a service, then it comes pretty darn close to slavery. If somebody, for example, has the ability to make a really nice cabinet, and I say, make me a cabinet, and he can't say that I refuse, then that person is effectively my slave. Healthcare is no different. Especially somebody that has trained for years, gone to school for years, and developed his ability, his wisdom in this particular field. If that man is incapable of saying, no, I will not treat you, well, then he is effectively my slave, and I can get him to do what I want. That's a completely different thing. And so that's the thing. A right cannot be something that requires action of another for you to have it. You have to inherently have it from birth. And so no, healthcare is definitely not a human right. But here's the thing. Even if it were a right, let's just assume that Bob Francis's premise was correct. Even if it were a right, why should the government pay for it? Someone please explain that to me. Because if the standard is going to be, well, as long as it's a right, the government has to provide it, as opposed to just the government can't prevent me from having it. If it's now the government has to provide it, why didn't the government buy my gun? Second Amendment is a human right. It's something that's actually in our Constitution as opposed to healthcare. So if something being a right automatically means the government must facilitate it, why didn't the government pay for my gun? Freedom of speech is a right. Pretty much I say that. Less and less people on the left now believe in that, but the vast majority of Americans as a whole believe that freedom of speech is a right. So why is it that the government didn't pay for my microphone? I mean, you look around this studio, I've got soundproof paneling, I've got my camera, I've got my mic, I've got my soundboard, I've got my computer. Why didn't the government pay for all this? This is part of my free speech, my ability to get out there and talk to others. Why didn't the government buy any of that stuff? Why aren't they paying my fees to Podbean and Restream and all the other services I use, if that's the case? I mean, we could go on and on about this. Let's go to freedom of religion, America's first freedom. Why didn't the government pay for my church building? Why doesn't the government buy my matzah bread and my grape juice for Sunday morning communion? Why didn't they buy my Bible? Like, if you're going to go down this road, these are the questions that you have to answer. Why is it that, well, all these other things are right, but also healthcare is a right, and not only is it a right, but they also have to pay for it? Even if you accept the premise, the conclusion still doesn't make any sense. And here's the thing. He does mention two things out of the three, because what he mentions in that statement is we want to make healthcare high quality and we want to make it universal. Well, here's the thing. Every country that has ever tried has only been able to make two of the three things that healthcare can be work. Two of them he just mentioned. Whether or not it is high quality and whether or not it's universal. The third one is cost. There are lots of countries that have affordable healthcare that is also universal, but it's not high quality. And then you have some countries like, I believe it's Sweden, that has high quality care and also has universal care, but they pay through the nose for it. I mean, it is super expensive how much the government spends on their healthcare system. So you can have 2 out of 3, and frankly, if you have 2 out of 3, you're doing really well, but you can never have all 3. America, our capitalist system, has developed a system where the 2 out of 3 that we have are affordable and high quality. It's just not universal. And if we make it universal, we're going to lose one of the other 2. We have to. The laws of economics demand that that happen. Because there is no way that we will be able to put everybody in a risk pool that has no risk involved, that everybody's covered regardless of what they get, and that's still going to be cheaper. It's just not possible. It would be the same thing if we tried to provide everybody's food or something like that. Well, you can't cover more people and say, but it's also going to be cheaper. That's not possible. But this is the case that Bob Francis is trying to make. And so what he does is he carefully ignores the cost side of it. And you notice that he even said without regard to cost, which was pretty hilarious on that part, that if you were paying attention, Bob Francis kind of underhandedly admits, yeah, you're going to have to pay through the nose for this thing if it actually comes to place. But Bob Francis' descent into madness does not end in Montgomery. He's been going off the rails for weeks now. We're going to look at just a couple of other clips to kind of go on this. This is one that he's talking about on the Second Amendment.
Tell us about your plan on the confiscation of guns, which obviously many believe is unconstitutional. Also very concerned that it plays right into the hands of Republican candidates.
To be clear, I'm not talking about confiscating anybody's guns.
Okay, but let's just assume that there's a rancher in Texas that says, I'm not going to do this because this is an unjust law and it's unconstitutional. What's the next step? I think that's what we need to concede, because there will be people that don't turn their guns back in. What's the next step for the federal government there?
Yeah, I think just as in any law that is not followed or flagrantly abused, there have to be consequences, or else there is no respect for the law. So, in that case, I think there would be a visit by law enforcement to recover that firearm and to make sure that it is purchased, bought back, so that it cannot be potentially used against somebody else.
Bob Francis there. We're going to play a little game here, because you'll notice at the very beginning of that clip, he says, just to be very clear, I'm not talking about confiscation. I'm just talking about police officers coming to your door and taking your guns from you. Bob Francis. Oh, Bob. Yeah, let's look at the dictionary.com definition of confiscate. Quote, to seize as forfeited to the public domain, appropriate by way of penalty for public use. Well, I don't see how police officers going door to door to collect the guns that you refuse to turn in, there's really not another name for that. It is confiscation. But that's the thing. The truth comes out. The truth is a mandatory buyback is a confiscation. It's a confiscation that has a little money attached to it, but it is not anything other than confiscation. You can call it a buyback, and he's avoiding using the term confiscation. He wants to use the word buyback, but the truth is they're exactly the same thing. For example, eminent domain, which the government used pretty freely, especially back in my high school years, something that the Fed was pretty notorious for, actually. The problem with that one is they kept constantly taking land, and yeah, they were paying for it. They were offering either market value or something similar to market value for it, but it was still confiscation. It was still the government taking something from you that you didn't want to give up. So yes, it is still confiscation. But the thing is, this is seemingly a pretty new position for Bob Francis, because old Bob Francis, he was saying the exact opposite when he was running in Texas. Take a look.
Can you flesh it out more? How do you plan to get assault weapons away from people who don't want to give them up?
Wait, that's incorrect. Hang on.
I own an AR-15. A lot of our listeners own AR-15s. Why should they not have one?
To be clear, they should have them. If you purchase that AR-15, if you own it, keep it. Continue to use it responsibly. I think Texas has a real opportunity to lead on this issue right now, because we so jealously guard that Second Amendment. We believe in it. We'll defend it. We have this proud, rich tradition of hunting, of owning guns for self-defense, for sport, for collection, as you may own that AR-15 for, just because it is fun to shoot. We support the Second Amendment. If you own a gun, keep that gun. Nobody wants to take it away from you. At least I don't want to do that.
It's a pretty far stretch, and remember, he wasn't running for Senate like in the late 1990s. This was 2016. So about 2 years ago, when he's running in a red state, Texas, where he knows that gun control is very unpopular, he's running on the platform of, look, if you want to keep your AR-15, keep your AR-15. I don't want to take that away from you. And now he's saying, oh, yes, we're going to take your AR-15. You remember back in the debate, he said, expletive that I can't say, yes, we're going to go ahead and take your guns from you. And so it's a complete 180. This goes back to what I said and opened up this segment with, that Bob Francis is a mirror. If he were a Pokemon, he'd be a Ditto. Whatever he thinks he needs to be in the moment to get the vote, he becomes that person. He has no principles. He has nothing that he actually stands for. It's whatever's going to get me a vote right now. That's what I care about. That's who Bob Francis is. Let's go ahead and look at another clip of him basically doubling down on this and explaining how it's not really confiscation, but it kind of is.
Can you flesh it out more? How do you plan to get assault weapons away from people who don't want to give them up?
It's pretty simple. As with any law in this country, we would expect our fellow Americans to follow the law.
You expect mass shooters to follow the law?
Our fellow Americans will follow the law, yes.
Congressman, mass shooters don't fall by definition. The mass shooters in Parkland, in El Paso, I could go on for 10 minutes. They don't follow the law by definition.
There are so many instances where the proposals that we've made, whether it is a universal background check or a red flag law or ending the sale of weapons of war or buying those that are out there back, would have stopped many of the shootings that we see in a country that loses 40,000 people a year to gun violence. Would it stop every single shooting? No.
But it doesn't make sense that people are going to hand over their assault weapons. If they're mass shooters, if they want to do harm to people, they're not going to follow the law. So then what's your plan?
Yeah. So I don't know that you make any law or stop making any law because you fear that some people will not follow the law in any part of American life. And so, yes, if somebody has an assault weapon, a weapon of war, and poses a danger to people in their lives or people in their community or people in our lives, then we're going to stop them.
Law-abiding people follow the law, but our problem is with mass shooters who don't.
You know, Allison, by that logic, we wouldn't commence writing any new legislation or signing anything into law for fear of some people not following the law. So we know, because we've seen this in other countries, that when we take this step, we save the lives of those who would otherwise be taken from these mass shootings. We prevent guns from getting into the wrong hands, and we take them out of the hands of those who shouldn't own them in the first place.
Okay, so a brutal, malicious takedown by Alison Camerado of CNN. Now, I want you to remember this. Alison Camerado is not exactly a conservative firebrand. She's not somebody like me. This is the person, first of all, she works for freaking CNN. I mean, they're the ones that put up that sham of a town hall right after Parkland that was specifically designed to make the NRA look like the villain from the very onset. They basically tried to put them into a mosh pit where people would be firing down upon them. I mean, it was a political ambush. So that's the network that you're dealing with. And Alison Camerado is the one that was lauding praise on David Hogg, talking about how wonderful and smart he was, and that anybody that disagreed with him was hateful, and they were mean for going after somebody who had just had such a big tragedy happen in his life. That's who Alison Camerado is. And even she's looking at Bob Francis's gun policy and saying, that doesn't make sense. That makes no sense. And statistically, what Bob Francis is saying there is completely wrong. There has not been any study done in any country that conclusively shows that the implementation of any gun control policy has curtailed mass shootings. It simply hasn't happened. Whether you're talking about the United States of America, one of the states that has the most mass shootings is California, where gun control is the strictest. Chicago has all kinds of gun violence, even though it's in a state that has incredibly strict gun control laws. The same is true in New York. It doesn't matter where you go, where you conduct the study. You could look at New Zealand, Australia, different countries that have implemented these policies and still continue to have mass shootings. Granted, at a much smaller rate than the in America, but that's not because of our laws. That's because their population is much smaller. If you control for population, we're not even out of the norm when it comes to a country our size, when it comes to mass shootings, despite having way more guns than any other country. So not only is everything Bob Francis saying completely incorrect, but it doesn't even make common sense. And even Alison Camerado is looking at that and saying, yeah, I don't think mass shooters are going to be turning over their guns just because there's a law that says you have to turn over your guns. And she's making the exact argument that people that are against gun control, like myself, have been saying for years. The only people that are disarmed with a gun control law are law-abiding citizens by definition. So if that takes place, you're not going to disarm a person. What Bob Francis is asking you to believe is that a person that, for example, in Sandy Hook, would not mind or think twice or think it incorrect to storm in to a elementary school to kill as many children as humanly possible, that person's going to look at a gun control law and go, darn, guess I have to give up my AR-15 now. That's what Bob Francis is asking you to believe. So either he believes you're an imbecile, or he is as big enough an imbecile to believe that statement. One of those two things has to be true. I'm not sure which Bob Francis believes, but I don't know that Skater Boy is necessarily capable of that kind of planning. But when it comes right down to it, the last thing that I want to mention, and we'll close up shortly after this, it goes back to Bob Francis's, I think, most egregious policy to date, and that is for him to remove the tax-exempt status of churches that happen to disagree with him. We'll go ahead and look at that clip right now.
This is from your LGBTQ plan, and here's what you write. This is a quote. Freedom of religion is a fundamental right, but it should not be used to discriminate. Do you think religious institutions like colleges, churches, charities, should they lose their tax-exempt status if they oppose same-sex marriage?
Yes. There can be no reward, no benefit, no tax break for anyone or any institution, any organization in America that denies the full human rights and the full civil rights of every single one of us. And so as president, we're going to make that a priority, and we are going to stop those who are infringing upon the human rights of our fellow Americans.
Congressman, thank you.
Okay, so there you have it. Bob Francis saying that, well, we have to remove the tax-exempt status of any religious institution that just disagrees with the LGBTQ agenda. Not goes out and brings some kind of injury to them, not even goes out and speaks openly against them, just one that opposes them, even internally. Their very existence must be persecuted. We must go after them. We must remove their tax-exempt status. First of all, the premise is incredibly flawed, because you heard what he said there is that there cannot be a gift or a tax break. This isn't a gift or a tax break. Tax-exempt is the default, not the exception. When you're looking at churches, religious institutions, they probably never actually registered as a 501c. I don't know if my particular church ever did officially or not, but the point is, legally, that's always the standard that is applied. The default status of any religious organization, be it a church, a mosque, a synagogue, a Hindu temple, whatever it is, if it's religious, the default is it is treated as tax exempt. This isn't giving them a gift, to use Beto O'Rourke's terms. It is bringing a punishment that did not exist beforehand upon them. That's what it is. And so, first of all, he's framing the question completely incorrectly. But secondly, if the government gets to tell any religious group what they're allowed to teach and what they're not allowed to teach, religious freedom is not a thing in this country. It's one of those positions where you kind of have to be an absolutionist, like free speech, because if there's even an incident of that not being applied, then you don't really have it. And by the way, I would be saying this, I actually have said this to people on the right that have said, well, Muslims, they're just too dangerous, and what we have to do is we need to make sure that mosques aren't allowed. You remember that there was a mosque that was going to be built right here in the capital city, and there were people wrongly, and I called them out on it, saying that, well, we don't really need a mosque in Montgomery because Muslims are dangerous. Look, I think that Muslims actually are dangerous in many instances. I think that at its core, fundamentally, Islam is incompatible with the laws of this country, and I also believe that Islam is a dangerous theology. But that doesn't change the fact that they should still be allowed to practice. Freedom of religion means freedom of religion for everybody, including ideas that I really don't like. That's a religion that teaches that Jesus Christ is not the Son of God, which, by the way, the Jews also teach. They're a lot closer to me religiously in several other instances and several other ethical and moral quandaries. But the point is, they still don't affirm that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. The same could be true of any other religion. They still should be able to practice. They still should have tax-exempt status. They should be on equal footing with all other religions, including the ones that I agree with. That's what religious freedom actually looks like. Not, oh, they're allowed to have freedom of religion, but we're going to fine them for it. That's literally Sharia law. Part of Sharia law is that you have the ability to either kill, forcibly convert, or invoke a special tax on religions that are not Muslim or sufficiently Muslim enough. And so what Beto O'Rourke is actually suggesting is a reversal, but the same idea, the same principle that terrorists in the Middle East are advocating for. I'm not saying he's a terrorist in the Middle East, but understand what I'm saying there. He's saying we need to put out a special tax on people that disagree with us. At its core, that is what Bob Francis is saying. It's absolutely reprehensible, but that's who he is. And here's another thing. Point to me the gay person that is having their human rights violated by a church saying that what they're doing is sinful. They may not like it. They might be offended by it. They may wish that they didn't say it. But that person's human rights is not being violated. You're not dehumanizing them to suggest that they're sinning. In fact, only humans are capable of sin. At least on Earth. I mean, there are obviously other spiritual beings, devils and that kind of thing that are capable of sin. But if we're talking about on planet Earth, the only creatures that walk this planet in a physical sense that are capable of sin are human beings. And so by suggesting that a person is sinning, you're actually humanizing them more. All of us sin. And a dog, a cat, a monkey, a giraffe, they can't engage in sin because they're animals. To suggest that something that somebody is doing is wrong, saying that they're dehumanizing them, no, actually, by admitting that they're capable of sin, they're actually humanizing them. And so the exact opposite is true. But ultimately, this is nothing but a bludgeon to try to coerce churches into doing what Bob Francis thinks is right. It's just conditional freedom. That you're allowed to have religious liberty as long as it's religious liberty that we agree with. You're allowed to have religious liberty as long as you're teaching and indoctrinating people the way that we see fit. That ain't liberty. That's the opposite. That's tyranny. And it should be called out for exactly what it is. The whole point of this country's founding was that so mankind could worship his God in a way that he sees fit. That relationship is between him and his maker and not the government. Every other nation in history had an official church, an official religion, and whenever somebody, a ruler, the King of England, changed religions, everybody in that country, no, you're that religion now because you're a member of this country. America was done in the exact opposite way. We're staying out of it. You worship God how you see fit. Not our place to say. Bob Francis is attacking the very foundation of this country. The whole point was to be able to have the liberty to worship God in the way that y'all see that you do see fit. So remember that at the beginning of this, I said that Bob Francis is a perfect mirror into the psyche, into who the Democrat base really is. And I want to do a quick review of what we've learned. First of all, he is as bad as Andrew Johnson, and even though we didn't play the clip today, Beto O'Rourke has also said that he's as bad as Hitler. America is racist to the core. At its very foundation, it's racist. It was founded upon slavery, which is a complete lie, but that's what he said. Healthcare is a human right, and therefore the government ought to be paying for it. Police are going to be coming for your guns because you're not trustworthy with an AR-15. We have to take that away from you. And finally, let's penalize all of the churches that say things that we don't agree with. And that's not even going to his policy when it comes to the Green New Deal, any of those other things. That in and of itself is a violation of several of the amendments to the Bill of Rights, the amendments to the Constitution. If that is the case, if Bob Francis really is a reflection of the Democrat base, and I believe that he is, we have a party in this country that stands in open rebellion to everything this country was founded upon. They stand in open rebellion to the Bill of Rights. And it ought to be something that terrifies everybody. We'll be back in just a moment.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. Now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible. Today's reading will come from Leviticus chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans, and after putting the fire in them, placed incense on it and offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. And the fire came out of the presence of the Lord, which created a wicked cool light show for them to see, and totally got everyone feeling the Spirit's presence. Then Moses said to Aaron, "It is what the Lord spoke, saying, even though I didn't command you to use this strange fire, I totally understand your need to express yourselves in worship and keep yourselves entertained." So Aaron therefore danced and yelled with joy, knowing that his sons were having a good time at worship. Moses called out to Mishael and Ezaphan, and the son of Aaron's uncle Uzziel, and said to them, "Come forward, carry your relatives away in front of the sanctuary outside of the camp, for they have fainted from being overwhelmed by the power of God's coolness." So they came forward and carried them still in their tunics outside the camp, as Moses had said. Then Moses said to Aaron and his sons Eleazar and Ithamar, "Do not uncover your heads, nor tear your clothes, because God wants us to always be happy, and as long as we're happy, He's happy. Therefore, if worship doesn't give you an overwhelming sense of euphoria, you need to find another congregation, preferably one with a more dynamic pastor and band." So they did according to the word of Moses. And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Do not drink wine or strong drink, neither you nor your sons with you, when you come into the sanctuary, so that you will be able to drink more once you arrive. It is a perpetual statute throughout your generations. And so as to make a distinction between the holy and the profane, between the unclean and the clean, because when worship stops being fun or feels judgy, then it becomes profane and unclean." Wow, so inspiring. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth. And welcome back, all. Thank you so much for being with us through the break, but I have incredibly good news for everybody. Al-Baghdadi has been killed. And this is something that has been a really good day for America. I don't think that there's any better way to put it. Obviously, the loss of a human life is sad, and it's sad that he chose to live his life in a destructive way that harmed other people. But the thing is, the reason that we celebrate and the reason this is a good day for America and for the world, really, is that justice has been served. Now, the thing about justice is it's not about vengeance. We're not doing this because we felt good. We're not doing this as a way to get back at him. It is done because it was the right thing to do to protect the innocent. Men, women, children, people that he has destroyed in his life, people that he has hurt. It was important that we take him out so that he no longer be allowed to do so. And the thing is, this is a person that led an organization, ISIS, that was notorious for thievery, murder, rape, forced conversions. I mean, just about every evil thing that you could think of, this guy was involved in. And so while he doesn't quite have the notoriety of Osama bin Laden because there wasn't a 9/11 style attack on American soil, I would argue that the guy's just as bad, if not worse. And the reason is, although his chaos, the evil that he committed, was kind of confined to the Middle East, ISIS at one time controlled a territory that was roughly the size of some of our smaller states. It was larger than New Jersey. And so when you think about that and really consider it, that's something that the Taliban never really did. I mean, they had significant influence in a region, Afghanistan, but they didn't really own land, and they weren't really a government in the sense that ISIS was. I mean, there was a time where ISIS was printing its own money and official documents. They had created a caliphate. And so in a sense, I think al-Baghdadi was more dangerous in certain ways than Osama bin Laden. So I do kind of weep for the fact that people don't know him as well. In fact, there were some ladies at work this morning when I said that al-Baghdadi had died. They kind of looked at me and said, who? And I had to explain who he was. Of course, that wouldn't have happened with bin Laden. So yes, he does lack the notoriety, but he's just as evil, if not worse. But despite this, the Washington Post saw fit to put out this headline, which doesn't really speak to that. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, austere religious scholar at helm of Islamic State, dies at 48. So first of all, they're kind of ignoring the fact that he didn't just die, he was killed by American forces and should have been. But austere religious scholar at the helm of Islamic State? Really? That's how you're going to characterize this guy. One of the worst terrorists in the history of the planet, and he's just an austere religious scholar that happened to run the Islamic State. Come on, Washington Post. Even you guys aren't that crazy. So this would be like, and this would be the case. Grigory Rasputin, austere religious scholar at helm of political party, dies at 47. Like that. That's the equivalent to that. Or Adolf Hitler, austere political theorist at head of German nation, dies at 56. The way that they couch this is just so absurd. Washington Post, there was a whole hashtag trending on Twitter the other day making fun of this, putting up other headlines kind of like the ones that I just postulated at. And the truth is they deserve every bit of it. Even if you're somebody on the left, you look at that headline and go, what the actual crap are you trying to peddle here, Washington Post? But here's the thing. I do believe that they were trying to downplay his evil, the evil of al-Baghdadi, but I don't think they were doing so because they wanted people to see him as something other than evil. I do think when there were headlines that were trying to paint Chavez or Castro, when it was trying to sort of put rose-colored glasses on their legacy, I do think that they were trying to make those people seem less evil, and the reason is because that pushed the narrative that socialism and communism really isn't that bad. So in that case, I think that was the end goal. In this case, I actually don't believe that to be the case. And the reason behind my assumption of that is primarily that they did want to make him seem less evil, but not because they actually wanted terrorists to seem less evil, but because they didn't want to give Trump too much credit. They despised Trump so much that they did not want him to get credit for taking down a really, really bad guy. And so because of that, instead of diminishing or trying to attack the accomplishment itself, they try to dumb down how dangerous this man was and how bad a guy he actually was. I think that was the strategy. Could be wrong, but that's what I think the actual end goal was. And so there's a difference in the motives there. The ironic thing about this, though, is that headline actually kind of gives credence to the idea that Islamic is a bloody, evil, violent religion, which, of course, I believe it is. But it would kind of poke at that because if a guy that committed all this mayhem and human suffering and raped little girls, and I mean just every evil human thing, burned children alive in cages, fed them to animals and dogs, just about every kind of evil that a human can do, ISIS was involved in. And if he's, just a religious scholar, that kind of points the finger at Islam for being behind all of this and their brutal religion for being the cause of all this evil. So it's weird that Washington Post did that. I think they the unintended consequence of that would be they're somewhat suggesting that Islam as a whole is evil, which I believe to actually be correct, but obviously Washington Post didn't mean it that way. So President Trump, of course, addressed the nation to announce this and make sure everybody was made aware of it. And here's a couple clips. This particular one is him giving credit where credit is due to the armed forces that carried out this mission. Take a listen.
U.S. Special Operations Forces executed a dangerous and daring nighttime raid in northwestern Syria and accomplished their mission in grand style. Mm-hmm. The U.S. personnel were incredible. I got to watch much of it. No personnel were lost in the operation, while a large number of Baghdadi's fighters and companions were killed with him. We were in the compound for approximately 2 hours, and after the mission was accomplished, we took highly sensitive material and information from the raid, much having to do with ISIS, origins, future plans, things that we very much want. Baghdadi's demise demonstrates America's relentless pursuit of terrorist leaders and our commitment to the enduring and total defeat of ISIS and other terrorist organizations. This was a very, very dangerous mission. Thank you as well to the great intelligence professionals who helped make this very successful journey possible. I want to thank the soldiers and sailors, airmen and Marines involved in last night's operation. You are the very best there is anywhere in the world. No matter where you go, there is nobody even close. I want to thank General Mark Milley and our Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I also want to thank our professionals who work in other agencies of the United States government and were critical to the mission's unbelievable success.
All right, so that's President Trump, of course, giving credit where credit is due. Now, I'll say this. When Osama bin Laden was killed in 2011, I gave Obama credit that I believed was due, but I also qualified that with, but I don't think any president deserves the majority of the credit. The majority of the credit goes to, in bin Laden's case, SEAL Team 6 and the professionals in our American military that did a very dangerous job and went in there and took the guy out. And the same is true here. President Trump deserves some credit. His office, his administration was involved in the mission, obviously. But ultimately, the majority of the credit goes to the people in the American military who actually put their lives at risk by going in and taking this piece of human filth out. And so I'm just adding the same qualifier that I did on both of them. President Trump, win for him. Good. Good job, President Trump. But also remember, and I think that President Trump did well in remembering that the majority of the credit needs to go to and be placed upon our brave men and women in uniform. Now, Trump does briefly mention his involvement. You heard a little bit of that there. He mentions it in another place in the speech that I didn't have in that clip. But he mentions his own involvement, and that's fine. But what is amazing there is that the left, immediately because he mentioned his own involvement, said that he was making political hay out of this. To which I looked at and responded, well, why shouldn't he? Like, there's a lot of things that President Trump makes political hay out of that I don't think that he should. And there's a lot of things that I've been critical of him in doing so. But this, I don't see why he wouldn't make political hay out of this. He is the commander-in-chief. He is the leader, ultimately, of our armed forces. And our armed forces just did something really awesome. So yeah, just like you put a big accomplishment on a resume, there is no reason that the Trump administration should shy away from making political hay out of this. And I also notice that Obama, in his announcement, also, the guy almost made it sound like he rappelled down the wall himself with a M16 rifle in hand and pulled the trigger and shot bin Laden himself. I mean, I know he didn't quite go that far, but to listen to that, and I encourage you to go back and listen to it, that's almost what it sounded like. And that was a tone that continued throughout the remainder of that campaign cycle. I mean, literally at every campaign rally that President Obama spoke at from then on, one of his big talking points was, oh, by the way, I killed Osama bin Laden, which in a roundabout sense, he was the commander-in-chief when it happened. So yes, he did. And it wasn't until later we found out that apparently it was the hardest decision ever, and he batted back and forth on it for like 3 days before finally saying, yes. I don't know, with me, You tell me that Osama bin Laden, there's even a 2% chance that we are going to be able to get him. I don't even let you finish the sentence. I say, well, go. Why are you even in my office? Yes, go get the guy. But regardless, that was all stuff that we found out days later. I gave Obama full credit when it happened. Who knows? We might find out that something like that happened with the Trump administration. I'll give similar commentary on that. We just don't have that information yet. But the point is, the left was not nearly so hesitant to laud praise on the president when it was Barack Obama's accomplishment. They're trying to find every angle to criticize President Trump on the same thing. Remember that the JV team comment where he was talking about ISIS as the JV team, what was the reason that President Barack Obama said that? He did that because there were people that were saying, yeah, you got rid of Osama bin Laden and the Taliban, but this ISIS thing is starting to crop up. And Obama was saying, no, I've taken care of all of that. I took out Osama bin Laden. That ISIS, they're just the JV team. That was the point that Obama was making. Obviously, he was wrong, but the idea that he never made political hay out of killing Osama bin Laden, bull crap. That was basically a campaign slogan. GM is alive and Osama bin Laden is dead. I don't know how many times I heard that in that campaign cycle, over and over and over again. So the media getting all butthurt about Trump making political hay out of it is just so incredibly ingenuous. They had no such criticism for their savior, Barack Obama, when he did exactly the same thing to a greater extent, I might add. So let's go ahead and look at this next clip. This is a little bit more of President Trump's commentary on it. And there were some people in the media that had some issues with this as well. We'll point them out in just a moment.
He died after running into a dead-end tunnel, whimpering and crying and screaming all the way.
Yeah!
The compound had been cleared by this time, with people either surrendering or being shot and killed. 11 young children were moved out of the house and are uninjured. The only ones remaining were Baghdadi in the tunnel, and he had dragged 3 of his young children with him. They were led to certain death. He reached the end of the tunnel as our dogs chased him down. He ignited his vest, killing himself and the 3 children. His body was mutilated by the blast. The tunnel had caved in on it in addition. The thug who tried so hard to intimidate others spent his last moments in utter fear, in total panic and dread, terrified of the American forces bearing down on him. Terrorists who oppress and murder innocent people should never sleep soundly, knowing that we will completely destroy them.
Amen.
These savage monsters will not escape their fate, and they will not escape the final judgment of God.
Preach, Trump.
Baghdadi has been on the run for many years, long before I took office. But at my direction, as Commander-in-Chief of the United States, we obliterated his caliphate 100% in March of this year. Today's events are another reminder that we will continue to pursue the remaining ISIS terrorists to their brutal end. That also goes for other terrorist organizations. They are likewise in our sights. Baghdadi and the losers who worked for him, and losers they are, they had no idea what they were getting into. Baghdadi was vicious and violent, and he died in a vicious and violent way as a coward, running and crying.
Get him.
Last night was a great night for the United States and for the world. A brutal killer, one who has caused so much hardship and death, has violently been eliminated. He will never again harm another innocent man, woman, or child. He died like a dog. He died like a coward.
Mm-hmm.
The world is now a much safer place.
All right, so here's the thing. There are a lot of things, there are a lot of responsibilities that the president has that when they come around, I'm like, oh gosh, Trump's going to screw this up. That happens on a fairly regular basis with me. I mean, when it comes to sometimes meeting foreign leaders, when it comes to being a dignitary of certain things, sometimes depending on the content of the speech in certain speeches, when it comes to things that are really formal, like the State of the Union, sometimes I just look at that stuff with dread and like, oh gosh. Because let's be honest, Trump's a very unusual president, and because of that, some of the things he does are unusual, and sometimes unusual is good, and sometimes unusual is bad. There is not a human being on earth I would rather have talking about the death of a terrorist than President Trump. There's a lot of things the president has to do that I wish that we had somebody other than President Trump to do it for us. But when it comes to this specifically, talking about how terrorists died, there is not a better, more qualified person on this planet than President Trump. I mean, you heard him talking about just how big of losers they are, how they died like a dog, the gruesome details of their demise. Good. I want America's enemies to hear this. I want them to have a mental image conjured up in their head of guys like al-Baghdadi running for their lives, screaming like a little girl, with dogs and the American military hot on his heels and killing him as he dies like a coward. I want that mental image in people's heads. That is as good a rendition of a mission like that I think you will ever hear. And when it comes to this, I want the terrorists that are currently terrorists to hear that and rethink their life and think about what they're doing. And I also want people that are potential terrorists who are thinking about maybe becoming radicalized and going over to join ISIS, whether they're in Europe or Asia or wherever they may be, or right here in the United States of America. I want them to have the president's speech in the back of their mind. I want them to be thinking about how al-Baghdadi met his end in as much detail as humanly possible. Heck, I almost wish that they would release the tape. If it weren't for the kids and their lives being lost in the process, being murdered by their own father, I'd say go ahead and release the tape. The fact that the kids were involved are the only reason that I'm somewhat hesitant to do so. Because I don't know that I could watch kids being killed by their own father. I mean, that's horrific. But the other stuff, yes, 100%. And I know that there have been people in the media, there's been people on the left that are trying to be critical of this, saying that it was the wrong approach, that he shouldn't have given this much detail. One of their points that I've seen that's really popular is, well, talking about it like this is going to spark some kind of retaliation. Well, here's the thing. Us killing the guy is going to spark retaliation no matter what. This happens every single time a terrorist leader is killed. There's always some kind of retaliation from the group. They always get a little bit more bold. They're trying to prove that the leader being gone hasn't clipped their wings, as it were. And so the death itself is going to cause retaliation regardless of what we say about it or how we handle it. You're living in a fantasy world if you believe that that is not the case. And so, yeah, retaliation is going to happen. But whether or not Trump handles it with kid gloves or gives the description that he just did, that's not going to embolden them any more than they already were. They're terrorists. They're already pretty bad people that hate America. I mean, these are people that train to suicide bomb themselves in the name of injuring America and the American people. They're not people that are going to be like, you know what, now we really extra super duper hate America. They already kind of super duper hate America. And so I see that as kind of a moot point. Another one is, well, this makes al-Baghdadi into a martyr. No, it doesn't. If anything, it does the exact opposite. Because now, instead of him dying for his religion, doing so in calm silence or anything like that. Like you think of the martyrs of the Bible, for example, men like Jesus or Stephen or Paul or Peter or the Apostle James, and the ways that they died, whether through biblical history or secular history, they die in some kind of quiet solace. They do so understanding that this is a price that they pay for their religion. None of them run away cowering in fear and using children as human shields. That's the exact opposite of a martyr. And so giving all of this detail actually does the opposite of making him into a martyr. It shows him for what he really is, a disgusting, filthy coward that took out his own children with him in an effort to spare his own miserable life. That's who al-Baghdadi is. You know what might make him into a martyr, though? Trying to talk about him as though he is just some kind of austere religious scholar at the helm of a religious state. Trying to talk about him as this peaceful pacifist that was just somebody who was an expert in the Quran. That kind of crap will make somebody into a martyr. Talking about who he really is does the opposite. And then finally, another counterpoint that I know that you're going to hear. Well, why did Trump have to include the details about the children? This one, I do think there is some validity and there's some genuine tenderness from those on the left not wanting to hear about the children in this situation dying. Look, I'm sympathetic to that one. I get that argument because the way that they met their end is absolutely horrible. But the reason it's important to be honest about it, to show the details and to show the truth, is the same reason that we do this with, for example, the shooter in Parkland or the shooters of different schools around here, to show the kind of person, the kind of malice and evil that really resides in their hearts. This is a man that murdered 3 of his own children. And people need to know that that's the kind of person that was running ISIS. So as horrible and gruesome as it is to think about that detail of the story, it's a story that needs to be told. Because it is a story that perfectly captures the kind of man that al-Baghdadi is. A coward. And one that saw other people as pawns to be used for his own protection. You see, I want people that are contemplating maybe going and fighting for ISIS to think about, if this man is willing to kill his own children to try to save his own skin, maybe this is a guy that wouldn't think twice about sacrificing me. That's a question that I want these people to be thinking about. It shows what a piece of human filth this guy was. And that is something that I commend President Trump on doing. Look, President Trump is iffy on his best day on some things that he has to do as president. This ain't one of them. That last clip perfectly epitomizes why there is nobody on this planet that could have done a better job explaining that than President Trump. Now, he's going to have bad days in his presidency coming up, and I intend to be as critical of him as I would be with anybody else. I'm going to try to call balls and strikes when it comes to that. But on this, I've got no notes, no scruples, nothing to criticize the president on. He did as good a job on this as I think anybody could have. End of story. And since we've gone for an hour and a half already, we'll go ahead and wrap things up right here on that note. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright